Everybody know that we will be recording this session. So thank you very much to both my panelists and our audience for joining us. My name is Jason Fiddler. I'm the marketing liaison at Epilepsy South Africa. Forgive me, I've got a bit of a gravelly throat, but I'm sure quite a few of us are enjoying the start of winter. Now, today we are talking epilepsy in the workplace, and I am joined by two very esteemed and experienced HR practitioners and people knowledgeable in their field. I'm starting here with Charlene Castle, our National Director of Epilepsy South Africa, herself, a person with epilepsy, who is the first director of Epilepsy South Africa, previously SANEL, since 1967, who themselves have epilepsy, is a person with epilepsy. Charlene, you also, of course, have a very extensive background in HR yourself, and I think that's a wonderful value of experience that you're going to bring to our conversation, and speaking from the heart as a person with epilepsy. And we're also joined by Andrew Godlinton. Andrew, I hope I pronounced that correctly.
You did.
Thank you. Andrew is the Director of Labour Associates with over 20 years of human resource and industrial relations experience. Andrew, it's wonderful to have your bevy of knowledge that we can bring forth to this conversation. So welcome to both of you.
Hello, everybody.
So thank you, Jason. Thank you for having us and for hosting today. It's always very exciting for me to know that we're having these informative webinars and have so many people joining us online. And I think even when we put on our YouTube, the viewership just carries on. So yes, this is an important topic close to my heart, close to our hearts as Epilepsy South Africa, in terms of educating people in South Africa about this important neurological disorder and those affected by epilepsy. And in this case, certainly the employers of people with epilepsy. So thanks, Jason.
Absolutely. And it's wonderful to see so many attendees right as we get off the bat. I'm sure we will have more people joining us. Remember, you can direct your questions through the Q&A function on your Zoom meeting panel at the bottom. We have two questions to actually get started with, so I'm going to fire them both off, or shall we just start with the one and follow with the other?
Yep.
I think it's really important to say to everybody today that we've made this a lot about question and answers. So we'll open the chats. Jason will look at the chats. We wanted today to be very engaged, not just one way, just us sharing information. So it'll be quite dialogue based. And I look forward to hearing from all of you.
Super. So the first question that we received are, what are the pros and cons of disclosing your epilepsy to your employer? They weren't very specific whether that's at the interview process or whilst you're employed, but I'm going to leave that open to the two of you to address. What are the pros and cons of disclosing the fact that you're a person with epilepsy to your employer?
So, Andrew, if I may, I'll just jump in here. So I think we're talking about a process. So it starts at the interview, and it starts even before that when you write your CV and you share it with a potential, or you're applying for a job. And often I get asked is, should I disclose on my CV? Now, the advantage of that is that the employer will immediately look at this, and that will contribute to their equity plan. So they would see it as positive. The disadvantage is that there's no way to know if your application was unsuccessful due to discrimination. So it really is an informed decision of yours. During the interview stages, you have the opportunity during your interview stages to disclose in your interview. And what are you doing there? You are breaking myths, you're breaking stigmas, you're sharing information. You need to be telling your interviewees what you're going to need and why you're talking about your epilepsy. Again, the downside is you don't know if you're not hired because of your epilepsy, because of discrimination. Now, Jason, you just been asked to share the question in the Q&A, or everyone share question in the Q&A. I'm going to go quickly just in terms of when you offered a job, people will say, you know, I've been offered a job. Is it now the time to disclose that I've got epilepsy? And often you again then say the positives about that is that you give the employer the opportunity to offer reasonable accommodation and to be understanding of your needs, and they are prepared for you. The other side of the coin is if you don't do that, the employer, and I'd love Andrew to weigh in here, the employer can use that to at your disadvantage once you are employed, and they can really hold that against you, because then that would be your non-disclosure, and immediately upfront you're showing there's a trust issue between you. So yeah, I'd love just to hear Andrew's thoughts on these things.
Yeah. Well, I'm very pro disclosing whatever it is, whatever your status or health concerns or chronic illnesses are concerned, because going back into my time in the corporate world, I've actually had an incident where a person suffering from epilepsy did not disclose. And this is a person working in a warehouse. And in the end, landed up injuring himself and in fact refusing help from paramedics that I'd called. So there's no doubt in my mind that, let me rephrase it like this, honesty is best practice. Charlene is 100% correct in saying that you don't know whether you've been discriminated against, and one can only look at issues of discrimination perhaps once you are employed or in that position, because it would in all likelihood become apparent that whatever action your employer is taking against you is discriminatory. So, but from a recruitment point of view, it would be very difficult. Obviously, the law protects you from discrimination, and I mean from the Constitution all the way through to all the different types of law, but certainly including labor law, you cannot discriminate. And I think what people often see is, well, medical information is private. Therefore, you're not required to disclose it. And I think we need to get past that and look at it from an honesty perspective and rather disclose right up front.
So, Andrew, just to add to what you're saying, I think what people don't realize in South Africa is we talk labor law, and that's one legislation. The other legislation is there. Everyone knows about the white paper in South Africa. There's the white paper for the rights of persons with disabilities, protects a person with a disability, and that comes from our South Africa. It's a human rights issue. That comes from South Africa adopting the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So right through the highest levels globally and in South Africa, you are protected, and that's the origins of the labor law with discrimination against persons with disabilities. So there's layers of protection for you in terms of discrimination. And we know South Africa is rife with discrimination, whether it's been race, gender, religion, whatever it is. So just to layer what Andrew said again as well.
Just one further comment on that. Some years ago, government or Department of Labor brought in a new document, which is called an EEA1. And that is a document that is used to disclose disabilities. Now, again, from practical experience, I found that people, and this is going back 5 or 6 or 7 years, actually wanted to, or were almost lying on that form because they didn't want to disclose. Because historically in this country, we obviously have discriminated against, well, take your pick. So, excuse me. So the point is that document, and to Charlene, your point, that document is there to disclose how many people with disabilities you are employing. So it's actually in your favor to disclose people with
Okay.
disabilities.
Okay.
What we, if I can hop in there, one of the things that we've certainly noticed is that the stigma of disclosing your epilepsy remains a barrier for people. We recently saw a statistic that a significant number of people who are diagnosed with epilepsy choose not to share it. But that is in fact holding you back in terms of access to medical care and of course access to accommodation by your employer. Is that not the case?
Leave that to you, Andrew.
Sorry, I think I had a
Sorry.
break in communication there. Sorry, say again,
No
please.
problem. So I'm saying that people are holding back about disclosing their epilepsy diagnosis, and they're doing that for various reasons. In many cases, they don't want friends or family to be aware of it, and it is a very real thing that contributes towards this the aura of stigma. There's always going to be those that will be braver and do so, but you would agree that in disclosing your epilepsies, at least your employer in a confidential environment will allow that person to follow labor law and accommodate you.
Yeah. But I mean, you know, yes. But I mean, look at it from a health and safety perspective. If
Right.
you've got people in your office that are suffering from whatever, whether it be epilepsy or whether it be a heart condition or whatever, how important is it to know so that, I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, I'm diabetic as an example. So what happens if I suddenly land up going into a coma and nobody knows why I'm sitting there looking like I'm sleeping? It is so important. And I can only go back, as I've already alluded to my practical experiences. Obviously, from a health and safety point of view, you have what's called a 16.2 appointment, and that is the person responsible for health and safety in your organization. I've experienced, like I say, a person suffering a seizure and didn't know what was going on. I've experienced people with having heart attacks and not knowing up front that they had a heart condition. And where it actually, in my mind, gets even more serious is people that are in those situations tend, strangely enough, to refuse help from paramedics. So you actually land up, these things escalate and they escalate, and you land up dealing with some fairly hectic situations. So in my mind, disclose it, and where accommodation needs to be made for the person within reason, and I think that's an important point to make. It has to be within reason. It's got to be that way in my mind.
So there's levels of disclosure. So what you can do is you can choose who you disclose it to in the office. Choose your HR person. Choose somebody that you trust if you've got epilepsy in your environment, where you know you won't be discriminated, but you can trust. That's really, really important. And a lot of the companies that I work with have confidentiality documents within the diversity and inclusion space in corporates, and particularly corporates today and companies that are very, very, very focused on, they call it D&I. Now, what is a reasonable accommodation in a company for a person with epilepsy? And that should be like you hearing reasonable accommodation. What does reasonable accommodation actually mean? Reasonable accommodation means is, how is your company or place of work assisting you to enable you to do your job correctly and give you the tools to do your job? So here are a couple of guidelines. So we know that lack of sleep impacts seizures. I know for myself, I've had an excess of 65, 70, 75 grand mal seizures, tonic-clonic, some of you may know them, in the last 3.5 years. I've been incredibly sick with my seizures, and we can't count the absent seizures. So I'm really blessed to be sitting here. One of the things I know is sleep deprivation triggers my seizures. So arrange your work schedule to ensure that you do not suffer from sleep deprivation so you don't jeopardize yourself. If you're working with machinery, ensure there's safety mechanisms installed on your machines. And remember, telling your employer if you're doing that type of work that you know that you have epilepsy is so critical. If you have a concrete floor where you work, make sure there's a carpet down around you in case you fall. When you have a seizure, you need them to practice first aid. And you need to make sure that your head's not damaged. So reassign yourself to non-essential duties once you've had a seizure. Some of these things is what reasonable accommodation looks like. If you've had a seizure and you are knowing you're vulnerable, speak to your employer about having flexible work time so you can get that sleep in. You've had your REM sleep, you rested your brains. If you're on shift work, make sure your shifts are regular. Again, 8 hours sleep is critical. Sleep triggers seizures. Now, after you've had a seizure, make sure that you have a rest period. And that would go to accommodation in an organization to understand. I had to share with Epilepsy South Africa, post a massive bout of grand mal seizures, 15 or 10 or 15 in one day. They all lost track. I had to share that in my role, my memory, my short-term memory was recovering still a couple of weeks after my seizures. So sharing that is people accommodating you in meetings. Sharing that is people showing understanding. But what am I doing? I'm disclosing. What am I being? I'm being courageous. What am I doing? I'm educating people about epilepsy. So those are a number of different things. I'd like to, if you'd like to, just Jason and Andrew, me jump into photosensitive epilepsy in the workplace, because you have different types of seizures. Would you like me to jump in and just go straight in and deal with that now?
I think if you wouldn't mind, and then we can come to some of these questions that are coming through. I think it's important for us to contextualize the kind of seizures we're looking at in an employment environment.
So when I was younger, I had photosensitive epilepsy. What that is any flashing lights would trigger seizures. If I was in strobe lights, if I was in bright lights, wherever I was, it would trigger seizures. So in the workplace, how can you be accommodated? Well, very, very bright lights, excessively bright white lights will trigger your seizures. Light sensitivity, you'll know this if you have photosensitive epilepsy. Your monitors, if you're working on screen, make sure they're dimmer. Any flashing lights in your environment, make sure they're not in your line of sight. And if they are, speak and teach people around you. Replace the flickering lights with gentler lights, because flickering lights are not necessary. So those are just like an off the bat, Jason and Andrew and everybody present, just some thoughts. What have I experienced with lots of people asking? Little screens do not help because you're straining your eyes. Make sure you've got a larger screen. Make sure that screen setting on brightness is down. Make sure you're sitting correctly. You're not straining. So all these things really are encouraging you to take responsibility for your epilepsy. Not doing that disempowers everybody around you. And actually, recently, we had an Indaba for National Epilepsy Week, and I got a bit of a perspective because one of the people with epilepsy in the audience stood up and said, I stigmatize myself. And I was like, well, what does that mean? We're so busy saying that we marginalize, that people with epilepsy aren't understood, that this and this and this. But what about us saying, it's okay that I've got epilepsy and I'm brave enough to speak about it, because then you're taking responsibility. Just a few more points to think about. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you. We have a question from someone who Gerald tells us that his contract was terminated on Tuesday as an employee. He's suffering from epilepsy. He's a person with epilepsy. I'm not sure, Gerald, from your question, whether your contract was terminated because you have epilepsy or incidentally. He says that he's on medication now and has not had an episode since the 9th of March. As a field technician, he's on the road a lot. Could we please give them some more information regarding controlled epilepsy and uncontrolled epilepsy? Charlene, I think there's something that perhaps you can answer.
So
And then,
can I just read his whole, is this in the
have you
Q&A?
got yeah.
Okay. So give me some about regarding controlled and uncontrolled. Okay, so your controlled epilepsy is when you've been stable for a period of time, minimum of 3 months, minimum of 3 months. I know I'm really stable and I know very controlled when my cognitive ability is restored completely, when I'm feeling fresh, all these different, but I know myself with my epilepsy. So I encourage you. So how long you take to ramp up on your medication, that your seizures are under control, and that you are no longer at risk. You need to take cognizance of that. Uncontrolled epilepsy is when you're just breaking through your meds all the time, where your meds are not just aren't holding you, you're feeling disassociated, whatever your symptoms are. I start feeling, and many other people start feeling disassociated. They have headaches, they miss lots of conversations, they're feeling they want to sleep a lot. So controlled and uncontrolled is literally a difference between having brain activity where those electrical currents are pounding on that lobe, wherever your epilepsy is found. Heightened electrical activity, that's what epilepsy is like. You put your finger in a plug and you've been shocked. This is a shock running through a lobe. So uncontrolled means your seizures are ongoing. You need to be speaking to a nurse at a clinic, a GP, your doctor at the clinic. If you've got access to a neurologist, very few and far between, have that access, but you need to ramp up your medication. Controlled epilepsy means driving is okay. Uncontrolled epilepsy means you may not get behind a steering wheel. You could kill yourself or others. Pushing yourself back to work if you're on the road a lot and you've had a seizure recently, it's not conducive to seizures being settled for a range of reasons. One of the things, you need people around you to support you. You need somebody with you who understands to save your life if you have a seizure. So take advice whether the period of time since your last seizure is considered for you to be work ready, that your seizures are under control.
Thank you. I did pick up, well, I know that one of the earlier questions we'd received, and Andrew, I think this is perhaps something that you can speak to, a person whose employment has been terminated because of their epilepsy, either because of knowledge of that epilepsy or perhaps a seizure has taken place at work, and that has led to the employer terminating the employment. Could you speak to that?
Look, I mean, to the person who wrote, whose question you posed a few minutes ago, there's a lot of there's a lot of information that one would need to look at in order to determine whether he was dismissed. So, in specifically for being an epilepsy sufferer, but the question, and I used the words reasonable accommodation. So you've disclosed it to your employer, everything's fine, you can do your job, then there's no issue. However, and one's also got to have in the back of your mind, what type of work are you doing? So if you were a window washer in a 50-story building, that could be a problem. So in other words, what we're going to determine through what is called an incapacity investigation, what we're going to determine is, can this person do their job or not? And if they can do 80%, well, now we can bring in that accommodation. If they can do 90, same thing. But what happens if they can only do 50% of their job? Eventually, you're going to get to a point where you now start looking at, like I say, this incapacity investigation. And it wouldn't be me as an HR or an IR person making a decision. It would be me saying to you as an employee, I need a medical report, a full medical report. And based on that medical report, we will make the necessary decisions. I'm an HR person. I'm not a doctor. I'm not qualified to make that thing. So in the end of the day, it's quite simple. Let's determine, based on your doctor, and if they refuse, by the way, the company has to do it and pay for it. So based on that medical report, you may land up in a situation where you actually, practically speaking, cannot do your job. And in that case, would then obviously your services would be terminated, but for incapacity, which essentially is a no-fault type of termination.
I see. Charlene, any thoughts that you have there?
It goes back to disclosure. I think it's such a difficult topic because we understand in South Africa that many people are out of our unemployment rate's the highest it's ever been. So the fear of disclosure is significant in CVs, in interview stages, in recruitment. We know globally stigma and myths about epilepsy have never been bigger. People are fearful of epilepsy. So it's such a difficult, complex conversation because everybody needs to be gauging the environment, gauging the interactions. There's no one size fits all. There's no, in an environment, if you disclose, you're going to be fired. It doesn't work like that because people are people and every place is different. So if you are dismissed and you feel it's because of your epilepsy only, you need to seek advice. You need to ask an expert. Go to labor court. If you feel like you need to go see CMA, go and chat to them. Ask them. Labor law is there to help you. If you know in your hearts that you've been performance managed and you've not been performance, you can't at the lastminute.com pull out, I have epilepsy and you've discriminated, because you can't use it. There has to be evidence that you've disclosed. There has to be conversations. There has to be, if you are not going to work because you're having so many seizures because your work hours are so long, you're not sleeping, and there's that whole spiral that needs to be managed within the environment. And you talking about, I need reasonable accommodation. I need you to be looking after me. I'm valued, and having those conversations. So I think when we throw, I'm discriminated at, and there are definitely cases about it. Andrew knows, we all know, it's categorical that this happens. I'm seeing it I think I'm seeing some of it on the chat. So I'm just looking if anyone, that's pretty much, I mean, Andrew, am I leaving things out there? Do you want to add to that?
I think this, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, Ioannette, speaks about temporary incapacity. And I think that's an important point to make, because people think that, well, if I'm going to, assuming I've disclosed, etc., I'm going to lose my job, or if they incapacitate me, it's done. It's not necessarily the case. You can go the route, which I believe is the fair route, and something that I've practiced myself, is to go the route of a temporary incapacity. The terms and conditions of it are the same. In other words, generally speaking, you're not going to get paid, etc., etc. Permanent incapacity, becomes an issue with you and your pension scheme or provident fund or whatever. But what I'm saying is, if you, Charlene referred to a time when she was having some serious issues, and I'm saying that might have been a period of a month or 2 months or 3 months, whatever, where some form of incapacity could have been considered. So it's not to say that if you're going through, if I can use the term, a bad patch, that you now are going to, it's a foregone conclusion that you're going to lose your job. It isn't. So, but it's so important. And I think I sort of on the lighter side say to people, there's one word that is banned in my dictionary, and that's the word apparently. And so don't, you know, get your facts straight. If you have a problem, so the person that was dismissed on Tuesday, if they have a problem, you've got to get all of the details so that we take all of the guesswork out and we understand that detail, because people in my profession, that's what we deal in, is detail. And the detail makes so much difference. So if that person was dismissed for incapacity, what was the process followed? Was there substance to his dismissal? Was the procedure correct? So you go to CCMA or Labour Court or whatever, there's two things they look at: procedure and substance. So if you are being discriminated against, to go back to that topic, well, how have you been discriminated? Give us the detail. When did this happen? When did that happen? And then it becomes possible to assist you in those kinds of situations.
I hope that's helped you, Gerald, in answering some of those questions. Ada brought up a question, taking into consideration the MHSA. I'm not familiar what that is. When and where, with what restrictions, will an employee with epilepsy be declared unfit to work?
Okay, so
Andrew, what is the MHSA?
You want to jump in on MHSA?
I don't know what MHSA is, to be honest.
Yeah, Net's just raised hand, but we can't unmute because it's in a webinar. I don't think we can.
Okay, but I mean, to my earlier point, if you were doing or are able to do 70-80%, and the company reasonably so can accommodate you for the balance, happiness is. But if you were at 50%, then I would suggest that it may be very difficult if you're only able to do 50% of your job, for a company to accommodate you in the other 50% as such.
Sorry, Andrew, to jump in. Of course, I mean, I've just been. It's the mine H&S.
Okay.
Health and
Mine
safety.
Health and Safety. Thank you very much for those
I know the
points.
health and safety. I'm like, health. Thanks, Charles, as well.
Everybody's jumping in there. It's good to have a lot of experts in the room.
Don't worry.
There's another.
I just know health and safety. Yeah.
There's another question that's been asked, and I think there's a fair amount of people who are employed as drivers, or they drive in the capacity of their work. And Paul Keyshaw asks on behalf of a sibling who is a paramedic and always on the road, and a full-time driver that's living with epilepsy that is controlled. How dangerous is it to have a person with epilepsy behind the wheel? Charlene, would you like to answer that?
How behind the wheel? I go,
behind the wheel. Yeah.
Okay. Having someone behind the wheel when you have a seizure, oh my word, it's dangerous. You can have such an accident, because if you have controlled epilepsy and you've been controlled for a certain period of time, driving is fine. Now, in South Africa, we don't have an enforceable law as such. We know what our road controls and our fine systems and JMPD. When you get pulled over, you're not going to say, "Hey, I have epilepsy," and you're not going to. So they can't monitor it. There's no central IT system, information system. So we use really global standards. After overseas says 2 years after a seizure. It's not a reality. It's not real, that, in my opinion. When I've spoken to neurologists on panels, they will advocate and tell their patients 6 months seizure free till you can drive again. And that is acceptable, still difficult. I'm sure inconvenient, because how many people have got somebody who can drive them for 6 months? But again, gauge yourself. If you know how quickly you ramp up on your medicines, don't rush into driving. Make it 2 months, make it 3 months, but don't jeopardize yourself or others, because it does take time to stabilize your brain. The problem is that you can't see your brain. You can't actually know. And this is what makes epilepsy as an unseen disability so difficult for people. Because as a person with epilepsy, I'm feeling fine. 2 weeks after, 3 weeks after a seizure, I've forgotten I've had seizures. 4 weeks, 5 weeks. And I want to start driving and drive my kids around. My brain is not 100% healed by far. Neurologists say one tonic-clonic or grand mal seizure, which for those of you that are familiar or unfamiliar, your big seizures where your whole body goes stiff, you need to be put on your side, you may lose control of your bladder, and you're unconscious for a period of time. That's what I refer to. And one of those seizures, the neurologist will say 1 grand mal, 6 months recovery. In actual, your brain restoring to what it was pre that seizure. That doesn't mean life doesn't go back to normal in that time, but you've got to understand from an information perspective of what period of time your brain is actually recovering. So driving with epilepsy is fine. Driving with uncontrolled epilepsy is irresponsible. Driving with epilepsy that you've just had grand mal seizures or big seizures, you're having uncontrolled absent seizures, it's just irresponsible. You're going to kill yourself or someone else, and you're probably going to have your kids or family in the car when you do it. And you got to just stop and ask yourself and say, is this worth it? If you're a driver at work, you're paying for your family's food. You got to check, is that job the right job for you to be doing? And can you speak to your employer about alternative work in the business? Because again, you can't afford to be driving a truck or driving people around when you've had a seizure a week or 2 or 3 ago. It's not fair. It's a basic human right infringement. And you have human rights protecting you. You need to protect other people.
I think you've raised a very valid point. As much as Andrew has spoken to reasonable accommodation, I think we need to talk about being responsible as an employee and a person with epilepsy to at least yourself, and being honest and saying, I have this condition. It has been assessed by a doctor, neurologist. I'm either on medication or being considered not needed to be on medication. But as far as I'm concerned, Charlene, you should be on your medication. But you need to be aware that you are coming to the employee with a skill set and a set of responsibilities, and your health is part of that, whether it's epilepsy or diabetes or a heart condition.
So I think, the other point of reference is that till a number of years ago, a lot of people didn't know epilepsy was a disability, right? So I think that's also a starting point, that epilepsy is a disability. However, and I'm going to preface this, if you've had 2 seizures 20 years ago, you do not have a disability, all right? You have a disability if it affects your work and you're incapable of actually performing certain things in your life. And that you need to gauge with your medical professional, because a neurologist or someone in that space will say to you, yes, this is the case. My epilepsy is considered a disability. But so that you've got to be very, very cognizant as well. Any disability, if you have multiple seizures, as an example, you can and should have, you could go into a space of having a permanently not working, and then there would be permanent disability or rights or insurance or protection if you can't work, as an example. So you need to, again, be engaging with your organization. But because disability rights then does follow. And CCMA, Andrew can weigh in on the CCMA and labor law cases, Andrew, where somebody can't work anymore because they're incapacitated with a disability, and how that should get managed at work by the employer and the employee. I think that needs to be spoken about, because that definitely comes into play.
Look, I mean, in the end of the day, if an employee takes his employer to the CCMA because he's been unfairly dismissed, unfairly incapacitated, it's as I said, it's going to be based on what the medical practitioner has said, and. To give you an example, I've had a case, it wasn't with an illness, it was an IOD, but the principle is the same, where a person's foot was damaged on duty. I incapacitated her for 6 months. She took us to CCMA, and we won that case because, again, there's a thing called the reasonable man test in law. And so, in other words, whatever decisions I made regarding her incapacity, was it a decision that any other reasonable person would have made? And the answer was yes. So, in other words, in fact, the commissioner actually said you could have actually permanently incapacitated her and dismissed her permanently. She came back at the end of that 6 months period with eventually with another full medical report, which said that her foot was not healed. She couldn't stand, she couldn't do X, Y, and Z. As I've alluded to earlier, I said, well, what percentage of her work can she do? Can't she do? It worked out that she could not do probably 60% of her work. She was incapacitated on a permanent basis, and in fact, then that's when your any of your own personal policies obviously come into play. If you're on a pension or a provident fund, the employer must report it to them, and then they take over. And the law says that whatever your latest salary was or is, you can earn up to 75% of that salary. So it is limited to that 75%. In other words, what the law is saying is that you actually can't make money out of a disability, as harsh as that sounds.
I know, Andrew, it's, Helene's asking also a really interesting scenario I've seen. And just, yeah, I've got some thoughts, but I'd like Andrew, I think you need to read her whole case, because it's from an employer perspective. And one of I was actually thinking right now, and thanks, Helene, is that just to start talking on the employer's part. We've been really focused on the employee. The employer and the management team need to be well versed in reasonable accommodation. And I often get asked when I speak at companies, I get asked, what do we do as an organization for unseen disabilities? And it is a hard conversation, because if we look at the stigma and just the facilities management that go into, let's say, a person of small stature working at work, or a person in a wheelchair, or the likes of physical disability accommodations easier. So when I speak for employees, it's for employers, apologies, it's about having a diversity and inclusion workspace where the culture is inclusive, where staff are engaged, enough, and you have owned that space and put in systems that there's a person in a department that knows about the different disabilities, that's educated about what these disabilities, unseen disabilities are, and what they need to be managed. I was at a recent function, and a high functioning person with autism, quite serious autism, but functioning. And we walked to the restaurant, and there was quite a few people, and his support person walked him to an isolated space. And I looked at everybody at the restaurant and said, okay, reasonable accommodation prevailed for seen disabilities, but not for the unseen disability. Because he would have freaked out if he was walked through to the restaurant. So the employer needs to take cognizance and know the employee. So in that case, the employer would have known at early stages of employment that this is what that person needs, and how to manage it. I was working recently with a really large organization. Head of D&I is now a gentleman with muscular dystrophy. Meetings accommodate him. Brilliant, brilliant, just finished his master's. So I think there's so many cases here. So yeah, I think Helene, Andrew, if you just chat to Helene, incapacity in terms of workplace saying yes, he has seizures, and he's battling to work. Clinics saying no, he's not, he can work, which is really surprising because if he's having seizures, it's quite evident he's having seizures. If he's injured on duty, Helene, it's quite evident. If there's witnesses that this is the seizure and what happened, it is epilepsy. If he's known to have epilepsy and he's disclosed to you and he's having regular epilepsy, regular seizures, it's really a very clear case, Andrew, right, to be discussing, because there's no black and white. If he's having seizures, he's having seizures. And if that clinic is saying that, get a second opinion, bring in somebody else to weigh in on it. It's not a case of somebody just diagnosing and saying, oh no, it's a seizure, although epilepsy can be diagnosed by a GP through a number of questions. But in this case, Helene, I would encourage to get to a doctor where an MRI or an EEG can be done and can validate where the epilepsy is and what stage, what's happening with this person's epilepsy. Andrew, do you want to jump in on that?
No, I just think that, I mean, as I said earlier, if you have a person with it that is claiming, and I'm using that word on purpose because you don't know, or alleges at that stage, then let them go to their doctor. If you're not happy with the response or the answers or the lack thereof that you're getting from perhaps a GP or whoever, then it is, or it does become, in my opinion, your responsibility as an employer to then send that person for a full medical examination. Yes, at your expense, so yes, it is going to cost you money. But that's secondary to getting to a point where you understand where this person is at, so that you don't land up in a situation where you have a person with a disability now injuring themselves on top of that, because that becomes in a health and safety risk for you as a company or for you as an employer. So it's actually, honestly, really, really in your interests as an employer to send that person for a full medical examination rather than suffer the consequences.
Look, Andrew, you know, one of the benefits of disclosure is that a person in the environment would then know how to deal with it, with a seizure. So I'm blessed. I say I'm blessed. 3.5 years ago, I developed what they called auras. So when just before a seizure, like 30 seconds or a minute before, I have certain things that happen that I know I'm going to have a seizure. And I can make myself safe or quickly say to somebody, listen, Andrew, going to have a seizure in a restaurant, panic, don't panic, stay calm. I'm getting myself on my side, and I quickly have myself on my side with my head on my handbag or jacket. And I said, please just cover me. And I just, just look after me so I can come back. But let's say I have an absent seizure, or someone with epilepsy has an absent seizure working on a machine, and their finger gets caught in the machine. Yeah, that's an injury on duty, but has the epilepsy been disclosed? And then, Andrew, what happens post an injury from a seizure where an employee hasn't disclosed? I'm asking a question because it's a very interesting HR space for me. But if that person has had a seizure, they've broken through their meds, which means they've broken through their meds for a range of reasons, and it happens all the time. They've had a seizure, they're doing a job that they're at risk. So there's a couple of loaded things. If you have epilepsy and you have a chance of breaking through your meds because of last bout of seizures being probably under 6 months, and you're working on machinery, is it the best job for you, number one? And that comes to disclosure and conversation and disclosure with your organizer, the company you work for.
Yeah.
It goes back to driving. You could cause bad risk to damage yourself, injury, or someone else. And number two, once an injury does happen from a seizure, what then, Andrew?
Look, my clients are so sick and tired of hearing me talk about what I call foundational documents. Do you have company policies, contracts, disciplinary codes, all of that wonderful stuff in place? Now, the reason I say that is because, and there's another document, it's called a job application form. Now, I have put certain, let's call it declaratory questions on my application form. And one of them is, do you suffer from a chronic disease? So it actually goes back to that point for me, because if I've asked you the question in an interview or on that job application, do you have a chronic disease? No. And then the examples that we've heard today land up taking place. Well, one, you've then got to understand something, that you've actually been dishonest on a job application form, and dishonesty in job applications is considered a very serious type of dishonesty. So it kind of goes back to all of those initial things that take place. And that's why I said right at the get-go, I am so pro-disclosure, it's scary.
Yeah.
I understand all of what we've spoken about. I'm still pro-disclosure. So the point is in that case, well, one, it's you've been dishonest, or potentially you've been dishonest. Well, where do we go to from there? Because now you must also remember that the Health and Safety Act comes into play because you're working on machinery. And what happens, for an example, if you lose in that machinery, like Charlene's example was, your finger gets stuck in the machine and you lose a digit. The minute you lose a digit, it's a serious offense. You have to contact the Department of Labor. They're going to shut your operation down. They're going to bring in the inspectors, and they're going to do a very unpleasant inspection on your business. Is it worth it? That's the question as an employer that you've got to ask yourself, and I'm saying it's not. Why do you have to go to the lengths of that kind of chaos in your business life? Deal with it, becomes prevention. You know the story, prevention is better than cure.
I think there's a line here, Andrew, a line of where does discrimination start and where does good work practice, that line of that common sense that applies. So you can't get into a space of discrimination in the workspace. For example, someone has had a seizure for 10 or 20 years. One thing everybody needs to understand, epilepsy is not curable. Once you are diagnosed with epilepsy, whether it's 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, you have epilepsy. It just means right now you can even have had seizures, and then for a period of time, after 2 years, your medical team will start weaning you off your medication. You might have been seizure-free for 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years, and then suddenly a seizure happens. Epilepsy is a very, very, very difficult disability to manage because of that. So what I always say to everybody is, don't think because you haven't had a seizure for a while, you don't have epilepsy. Be careful, be conscious, be cognizant. Because even when me or a number of other people I've known, and speaking to a lot of people with epilepsy, obviously in my role, is that's always the concern. Even when I was seizure-free, it never doesn't sit there. My loved ones, those affected by my epilepsy around me, if I get flu and I get a temperature as an example, it's not treated just as flu and a temperature. I have to, through my whole career, go to somebody, even when I was seizure-free for a number of years and off medication, I was very conscious of if I got flu and I had a high temperature, I was at risk of having a seizure. High temperatures, I'll have seizures. It's that simple. This horrible flu going around, stay away from me. I'm barely seeing people because I can't afford. When I got COVID, it wiped out my epilepsy meds and I ended up in ICU, status epilepticus, one of 14 in ICU, not on a ventilator. So that is how serious you've got to look after yourself with epilepsy. And no employer. And how does that converse to an employer's responsibility? Again, when I was employed in corporate, and yes, a lot of people don't know, I came from corporate into the NPO sector, but I got really bad flu and I was sitting in a meeting and they were like, no, we'll have a deadline for tomorrow afternoon and we'll be doing this for the next day. And in the boardroom, I put my hand up and I said, guys, I have really bad flu happening here. I'm most likely not going to be at work tomorrow because I can feel how I've gone down today and I can't risk this. Now, for any of you that don't have epilepsy, or maybe you haven't had epilepsy, and you do get flu, you know how serious it can be. So you've got also, as a person with epilepsy, be honest, and you have to speak out. So when Andrew says disclose, 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 I never disclosed for many years. I only started speaking about my epilepsy about 10 years ago. Now I don't stop because the more people that learn, the more stigma I break, the more myths about epilepsy are stopped. Epilepsy, you are not demon possessed. It doesn't need to be exercised. You don't need to be locked away. No amount of water sprinkling or all these other strange practices that happen in South Africa will get rid of or stop your seizures or get rid of your epilepsy. So that's kind of like, if I have to say, you know, long story short is be cognizant of people with epilepsy in your life, and they need to be aware as well. As an employer, if you've got somebody that says, I have epilepsy, I had seizures 10, 11 years ago, check in regularly with that person. Are the hours working for you? Are you really exhausted? You're looking tired. Why haven't you used your leave this year? You've got 15 days leave. I see you haven't taken leave. Check in on the person. Have a human-to-human contact. And this goes back to, what is the culture of the workspace? Is it money first? Is it job first? Or is it people first? If it's people first, show kindness and care, because there's a lot of people living with a number of neurological conditions that are non-communicable diseases. They sit under NCD. Andrew refers to chronic illness or chronic disease. Unseen disabilities fall under non-communicable diseases. And that's just my advice to all of you in the workplace. Create an environment of communication. And, you know, just to go back to a little bit of sharing information about epilepsy, when you work and you've had seizures, you're going to have memory loss. And things to support that person in the work environment from an employer and employee and colleague space is create cue spaces, cue cards in the environment. Have a diary, use Microsoft To-Dos, keep cue cards, maybe use recordings on Teams meetings. I've got another example. One of my provincial facilitators on our Development Hub workshops is going to run one of the workshops, and he's a stroke survivor. So his one side of his body is damaged and a certain amount of paralysis in his memory. And there was a certain point said in a certain meeting that was quite an important part of information. And in another meeting, somebody said, well, he just didn't remember. And I was like, just remember he's had a stroke. He lives with a disability. So we support him in taking notes. We support him in putting things in his diary, keeping things written down. So we create an environment for a person with a stroke, as an example, like with autism, like with exactly like when working with a person with small stature. The same thing applies. Know the disability, understand the disability, and accommodate the disability.
Thank you, Charlene. Sorry, as I'm mindful of time, but I think we might go on a couple more minutes. I think it's very important that people take positive messages from this webinar as well. We've obviously spoken about scenarios that are not good. Either people have been injured on duty or they've faced a dismissal because of a disability. But I would say as an employer, you shouldn't be discouraged from having people on your staff who have a disability. The valuable human beings who can contribute to your environment. Not all work is relating to machinery. Not all work is relating to corporate. We could, for example, be having people in our attendees who either are employers or in working environment that's shop. You could be a cashier. You could be a worker on the floor handling stock. But that shouldn't discourage you from being confident in your diagnosis of self-diagnosis. I have epilepsy, or I'm considering that I've got a problem. I go and get it confirmed by a neurologist, by a doctor, and I really should let my employer know. I shouldn't be afraid that I'm going to lose my employment, and I shouldn't, as an employer, be afraid of taking somebody on because they have a disability. You know, they're kind of washing my hands and like, you know what, thanks very much, we don't need that. I don't think that that should be a prevailing attitude on either side. Andrew, I'm sure you agree.
No, I don't think one must be afraid. I think that if I could have go back in time and be granted one wish, it would have been to have been more educated with disability.
Yeah.
Because and if I may, I mean, look, in fairness, I consult to some of the epilepsy branches. And I was at one of them on Tuesday and experienced somebody having a seizure. And I said to the director of that branch, so what in this instance, what does that person need? And my point is, if I go back, I had a staff of 3,500 people. Why am I asking that question of myself now? I should have done something more. And that's the problem. So you don't have to be afraid. You just actually have to seek that knowledge. And how do you get that, or how do you seek that knowledge? Guess what? Disclosure. Put something in place. That's what you've got to do. Put something in place in your organization that allows you to understand who works for you. And once you've got that in place, guess what? You're going to be educated like I was educated on Tuesday. And now, you know what? I actually understand that if somebody fell over and they were having a seizure tomorrow, I actually would have a reasonably good idea of what I need to do to help that person. I didn't know that, you know, I didn't know the sort of the detail of what that person was experiencing. Well, now I do. And so guess what? I'm no longer scared of that, because you've also got to look at this thing from a different perspective. When you see as a non-sufferer, somebody going through that, what is most people out there in the public, what do you think their reaction is? They turn around and pretend it didn't happen. And they're doing that through ignorance. That's all.
I want to say, I'm going to add to what you're saying, Andrew. And one of the things, it's interesting hearing that you've seen your first seizure. Now, the first thing, any advice anyone should give in a workplace is, if the person you seeing a seizure happening, stay calm. Stay calm. Because it's fall down and need debriefing afterwards. Manage the space in a calm space. Seeing a seizure is very traumatic. Make no mistake. You can't control it. You have to sit with it. You have to wait for the person to come back. And, you know, epilepsy can be very debilitating. It is such a difficult neurological disorder to live with. especially when you know that cognitively you're not what you were, especially when you know that your memory is not operating like it was, and you watch people around you trying to help you. So having epilepsy, being on this side of the fence, I get really emotional when I talk because it gets hard. It gets really, really hard. And to be able to speak at work about your epilepsy I cannot emphasize it enough, because somebody who works with us so closely, like Andrew, he's shaken from seeing a seizure. He's speaking about a person that lives in one of our homes, that is living in our homes, because we have no homes. We're in 6 provinces, and we have homes around the country for people that can no longer hold jobs and live in society and don't have loved ones that can look after them, or loved ones that can support them financially or have medical aid, and we provide those services. But when you see that that's what epilepsy can do to one, it really is a reality check. So this unseen disability is really something to take cognizant of. It's in the top 3 of epilepsy. Is how do I say this? The third thing globally that people die of, more that actually pass away from, number 1 being cancer. To give you a sense of, over 50 million people live with epilepsy globally. So I also want to just correct some language. I'm not an epileptic. You're not an epileptic if you have epilepsy. You're a person with epilepsy. You're a person of small stature. You're a person with autism. You're a person because you're always a person first. And Jason said something, let's look at this from a positive space. I am a person. I have an enormously amazing, strong skill set that I bring to you. There's so much that a person with epilepsy brings, any disability, and often so much compassion comes with somebody with a disability, wisdom emotionally, because they have been discriminated against. So number 1, your language is a person with, please. It's always a person. It's not epileptic seizures, it's epilepsy seizures. It's seizures. And when you're using the correct language, you're also showing that you've taken the time to be knowledgeable, that you've taken the time to be educated, and you can take that language into your workplace. And when you do informative information sessions, that's just a small thing you can instill in your organization, where suddenly people with disabilities are going to feel seen. They're going to feel understood. And it's a simple thing like that. And what are you doing in that moment? You're going to say to your staff that have epilepsy, it's okay to speak. So employers, I encourage you to look at staff that have brilliant skill sets that are there because you wanted great people on your team. And if they do say to you, I have epilepsy, make sure your environment is one of inclusion and understanding, and use that person. That person would love to share about their epilepsy. I challenge you, if you've got epilepsy, to talk about it. I've been in halls when I've spoken to 100 people and know there's 10 or 15 people in the room with epilepsy. And when I ask, none of them put their hands up. So if you have epilepsy, I'm telling you it's okay to speak, because you're helping somebody else who doesn't talk out. So please talk about it. It's not something to be ashamed of. It really, really isn't. And employers, educate yourself. Employees, disclose. The world's not such a bad place. People aren't all unkind. I promise you.
No, they aren't. And it's quite extraordinary to see, almost all our attendees are still with us as we're about 9 minutes over, but we are talking about something that's truly, truly important. And we hope that you have you're walking away from this webinar with some extraordinary insight. There are so many complexities to an employment situation normally, let alone an employment situation that includes a person with disabilities, or a person with epilepsy in this case. thank you for the stories that you've been sharing with us and our panelists. Yeah, Charlene, if we can wrap up, please, you and Andrew, closing comments. Thank you so much.
My closing comments is that Epilepsy South Africa is the most amazing organization, not just because I'm national director, but it truly is in service of each of you with epilepsy and people learning and supporting and affected by epilepsy. Contact us on info@epilepsy.org.za. Join our support group on Facebook. There's a lot of people joining. If you want to become a member, just email membership@epilepsy.org.za as well. And we have a closed membership group on Facebook where there's social worker conversations and other things like that are there. So be in contact with us. If you've got your employer and you'd like us to come and have a chat and do an informative session or part of your disability forums, please just reach out as well. We're always open to supporting and always open to engagement. So yes, Jason, thank you so much for hosting today. Andrew, as always, I love engaging with you and listening to your wisdom. Back to Jason, thanks.
Andrew, just before we go, well, Andrew, if you can get your closing comments, and then I'll close off with our audience that are still with us.
Many companies have what is often called TED Talks. Instead of doing a TED Talk about a health and safety issue, or let's call it another safety, health and issue, do a TED Talk about people suffering from epilepsy. My closing comment is going to be educate yourself and disclose.
We've had so many wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew and Charlene, for sharing your time with us today. We have gone over, but really this has been a super informative session for us all. There have been wonderful comments in the Q&A and in the chat. They're very grateful for the information we've shared. People, we are going to be sharing the recording of this on our YouTube. So please, if you would like, go and visit our website at www.epilepsy.org.za. There you'll find links to our social media, including Facebook, and our YouTube channel, where you will get a copy of this recording. We're going to try and get that up by this evening, but give us a bit of time. And more importantly, you can see other recordings that we've had. We've had some wonderful panelists. We've had some wonderful neurologists here. We will regularly be doing these webinars. This is very important that we keep the dialogue going. Your participation helps. And as Charlene has said, please consider joining our organization. Your contribution can be small, but it can make a huge difference. Thank you, everyone, today. And God bless, and go home safely.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.